Hello and welcome once again to another reading group video. Dr. Andrew Palmer here with some introductory thoughts and pointers about this month's novel, which is Christopher Isherwood's A Single Man, published in 1964. Isherwood was already famous, particularly for Goodbye to Berlin, which was based on his experiences in the last days of the Weimar Republic and published just before the Second World War. A Single Man was his eighth novel and perhaps his greatest post-war work. And here is Isherwood around the time he wrote the book, plus the cover of the first UK edition. The novel describes one day in the life of a gay man whose lover has been killed in an accident. It was published, as I say, in 1964, at a time when homosexuality was a criminal offence, both in Isherwood's native England and in his adopted home in California. Indeed, during the 1950s and 60s, thousands of men were convicted and imprisoned for what was called gross indecency. With that distressing context in the background, the novel grows out of Isherwood's own experience as a gay man teaching creative writing at the University of California in Los Angeles. Some critics have been quite down on this novel, criticising it for not being more radical in addressing what used to be called gay liberation. For example, Mark Lilly, writing in 1993, damned the novel with faint praise as follows. "A Single Man is not distinguished as a literary work," he says. "There are no poetic heights and not much straining beyond the commonplace. Its range is small. It is the work of a gentle and perceptive social critic written in a relatively conventional mode, with good sense and considerable feeling. It deserves attention," I mean the subtext is not very much attention, "because however tame it might now appear, it is one of the very earliest novels to give an emphatically positive face to the gay experience." So what's bothering Mark Lilly is that George's sexuality doesn't become the driving element of a plot about gay liberation or gay oppression. George doesn't suffer overt prejudice. He doesn't have to fight to keep his job. Isherwood rejects that kind of plot-driven drama. We simply see George going about his day. He wakes up, he gets dressed, he reads on the lavatory, a great scene which I hope we'll talk about when we meet. He drives to work and he teaches a class. He goes to the supermarket, he has dinner with his friend Charlotte, and so on. However, I want to suggest that the novel is radical in a different, less obvious way. Isherwood draws us into George's perspective. We experience George's experience. We share his thoughts and feelings in a way that demonstrates his complex and painful relationship with the dominant straight culture. In reading this novel, straight readers will empathise and gay readers will recognise. So while this isn't a campaigning book, there is a quiet speaking back to power going on here. And how does Isherwood achieve this effect? How does he bring us into George's experience of the world? Well, we have the great modernist writer Virginia Woolf to thank for that. Stay with me. When Isherwood was starting to write A Single Man, in 1962, he was rereading Woolf's 1925 novel, Mrs. Dalloway, and he wrote in his diary on August the 22nd of that year, "Reading Mrs. Dalloway, which is one of the most truly beautiful novels or prose poems or whatever that I have ever read. It is prose written with absolute pitch, a perfect ear. You could perform it with instruments. Could I write a book like that and keep within the nature of my own style? I'd love to try." Well, he was already making that attempt. On the day he finished reading Mrs. Dalloway, August the 26th, by the way, he had produced 56 pages of the first draft of the novel that would become A Single Man. A Single Man and Mrs. Dalloway share many similarities. In both novels, the action takes place in a single day. Both protagonists are in their 50s, and the action is episodic rather than following some familiar narrative arc. And let me develop this connection between the two books a little further. Woolf's novel tells the story of Clarissa Dalloway, a society hostess married to a Conservative MP. As she prepares to host a grand party, she thinks back over her life, and we learn that as a young woman, she had a passion for her friend Sally. She remembers their single kiss as, quote, the most exquisite moment of her whole life. But the same-sex passion of this relationship was stamped out by the forces of conformity and propriety. She ends up marrying Richard Dalloway, who becomes a Conservative MP. And on the outside, she's very much part of the establishment. Woolf shows Isherwood new ways of representing the inner life of a person who is suffering quietly because they live at odds to cultural norms, to the dominant ideology which dictates whom it is appropriate to love. She pioneered a narrative style that takes us right inside the head of her characters. And we also encountered this style, of course, when we read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, the technical term for it being free indirect discourse, which we've discussed. And Isherwood adopts and adapts that same approach. So Woolf provided Isherwood with the means to tell the story of George, an English emigre in California, a middle-aged college lecturer who is heartbreakingly bereaved. Jim, his lover and partner of 14 years, has been killed in a car crash, and the story is set some months later as he struggles with his grief. Just as there was no space in 1920s English society for Clarissa's same-sex passion, there is no space in 1960s California for George's same-sex grief. That is to say, the story captures not just George's grief, but the pain of suffering that grief in a straight world where it's unacknowledged and almost entirely impossible to express. To his colleagues, his students, and everyone else, George is simply a single man. His grief cannot be expressed in the public sphere, so the apparently innocuous title of the novel packs a punch. It names what he must pretend to be, just as Woolf's title, Mrs. Dalloway, limits Clarissa to the role of Richard Dalloway's wife, the role she has to adopt. Both titles obliquely express the ideological constraints imposed on the central character. This begins brilliantly with George coming to consciousness first thing in the morning. The ambiguous first page of the novel anticipates the moment where he will be fully awake and suddenly remember the fact of his grief. We're told that George experiences, quote, a sickish shrinking from what waits. The thing that waits is his grief, and it isn't until the fourth page that he remembers, quote, he stops short and knows with a sick newness, almost as though it were for the first time, Jim is dead. The thoughts of the character and the voice of the narrator blend into one, drawing us in. Alongside the use of free and direct discourse, one of the key things Isherwood does to show us George's predicament is to repeatedly emphasise how the physical environment that he's forced to inhabit is intrinsically straight. In describing the suburb where George lives, Isherwood gives us an excoriating portrait of the heteronormative world of 1960s America. It's a space specifically designed for middle-class heterosexual married life. Isherwood describes the suburbs as, quote, breeding grounds. With George, we see the tyrannical children at play, the dreadful drinks parties, and so on. Significantly, George's house is built sideways on to the rest of the street, and you have to cross a crumbling bridge to reach it. It's a kind of refuge, but one in which he grieves alone. And to the local children, he's like a monster in a forest in a fairy tale. The only place he can share his grief over Jim is at his friend Charlotte's house, which is physically difficult to reach, up a steep flight of steps cut into the hillside. And how much of a refuge is it anyway? Charlie sympathises with him, but she also tries to seduce him, seeking to solve her own problems by inviting George to shrug off his sexuality. So while Charlie's house is the one place in the world where he can weep and be comforted, it can be no more than an imperfect and temporary refuge. And that captures the great sadness of George's dilemma. Various other locations in the novel work in similar ways, and as you read, consider the way Isherwood represents those spaces. I'm thinking of the freeway on which George drives to work, the campus where he gives a very odd lecture to his students, the faculty dining room where he gets into a heated discussion with his colleagues, the hospital where he visits the dying woman who once had an affair with Jim, and so on. So all of that is something we might discuss when we meet. As an example, I'll home in on one more physical space, which is important in the novel's final movement. So the novel moves towards a kind of coda, which takes place at a beachside bar called the Starboard Side. And this is the place where George and Jim had met years before and where their relationship was possible, because back then it was a haven of sexual liberty beyond the bounds of conventional morality. Now, these days, in the now of the novel, it's been partly sanitized, but it still holds some of its former transgressive vibe. So, for example, check out the wonderful description of the bar that starts on page 118, starting with the sentence, "The Starboard Side has been here since the earliest days of the colony." This is where George runs into one of his students, young Kenny Potter, with whom he's had some rather ambiguous exchanges earlier in the day, and we experience an unsettling mixture of hope and disquiet in this section of the book. Like the other two novels we've read so far, there's no simple ending or closure here. We're left wondering what we hope for in the story. Do we hope George finds solace for his grief in a relationship with Kenny Potter, or do we find the idea unsettling and morally dubious? So George gets drunk, and late at night they stumble out of the bar and cross over onto the beach, and he and Kenny go skinny dipping in the ocean. And here is the key passage. "These waves are much too big for him. They seem truly tremendous, towering up, blackness unrolling itself out of blackness, mysteriously and awfully sparkling, then curling over in a thundering slap of foam which is sparked with phosphorus. George has sparks of it all over his body, and he laughs with delight to find himself bejewelled. Laughing, gasping, choking, he's too drunk to be afraid. The salt water he swallows seems as intoxicating as whiskey. From time to time, he catches tremendous glimpses of Kenny arrowing down some toppling foam precipice. Then, intent on his own rites of purification, George staggers out once more, wide-armed to receive the stunning baptism of the surf. Giving himself to it utterly, he washes away thought, speech, mood, desire, whole selves, entire lifetimes. Again and again he returns, becoming always cleaner, freer, less." This is a wonderful piece of writing, and it's a moment of release for George, a joyous epiphany, a moment of realization. And we may start to wonder if this story is leading us towards an uplifting ending with George embarking on a relationship with Kenny. But the representation of this moment is also starkly political. Isherwood has set up an opposition between George's freedom in the ocean and the social constraints waiting for him back on dry land, where the suburban family homes and the police patrol cars shine their lights. Isherwood writes, quote, "George and Kenny are refugees from dryness. They have escaped across the border into the water world." This is what we might call a politics of space. The ocean represents freedom from the power of the establishment, the straight world, but George and Kenny have to return to dry land at some point, and we'll discuss how Isherwood represents that return in the final pages of the novel when we meet. And by the way, this is connected also to the novel's slightly mysterious final 2 pages, where the narrator does imagine a kind of permanent oceanic state for George, something we will also discuss, I hope. So I've aimed to suggest some ways in which A Single Man is a powerful novel about gay experience, far more so than a more polemical or campaigning type of book. Isherwood is writing in a modernist tradition which sees the purpose of literature differently. Its role is not to propagandize, but rather to show the interior experience of the individual under the ideological pressures of the modern world. So that's my tuppenoth. Enjoy reading the novel, and I'll see you soon to discuss all this and more. Cheers.